Hi there, and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to resume my Swift testing series by looking at the expect macro and how we can use expect to assert that our code is working as intended. We'll be looking at how we can compare Boolean conditions to, for example, check that a function returned a certain value, or that providing a certain input to a function produces a certain value, or even to maybe check that a certain object is in a specific state after you've called one or more functions on it. After checking for Boolean conditions, we're going to take a look at errors. We can actually expect functions to throw specific errors, error types, or never throw an error at all. So we'll start with Booleans, then work our way into errors. If you're not yet subscribed to the channel, but you're interested in learning more about Swift testing, I highly recommend that you hit that subscribe button right now so that you're always up to date when I upload a new testing video. With that said, let's dig right into the programming section of this video and see how the expect macro can be used. So over here in hex code, what I have is a couple of classes and functions that we can test. And the first one that we're going to test is my incrementer object. It has two functions. One, a function that should always return 5, and the other one is a function that should always increment the input that it's given by a certain amount that we also give it. Very simple functions, and they're currently implemented correctly. So what I'm going to do for the sake of testing is, on purpose, I will make these functions incorrect. The first thing that we'll do is we'll test the return 5 function, and that looks a little bit like this. We'll have our test macro, and we'll say test return 5 returns 5. That's all we need initially. So what I'm going to do inside of this test is I will create my incrementer, I will get a result, and I will say result is correct equals result equals 5. And then what I'll expect is result is correct to be true. We're not going to take this suggestion right here from the AI, so we're just going to have this function right here. I make an instance of my incrementer, I obtain a result, I check whether my result is correct, and then I expect that that is going to be true, because this right here evaluates to true or false. So result is correct will be a Boolean value. If I run my test right now, we should see that it fails. However, it didn't fail with a lot of context. In fact, all we know is that result is correct failed. So what we want to do right now is change the way we wrote our expect. And what we can do is two things. First, we can move our evaluation into the expect macro, and we can provide some context. So we can write expected return 5 to return 5. If I run the test now, what we'll see is that everything works as expected in terms of the output. We'll get result 10 equals 5 failed. So that's already giving us a lot more context, because now we know that we got a value 10 back instead of a value 5. And we can change our code accordingly so that it returns 5. If I run my test now, we'll see that the test succeeds. And that is very nice. So with that done, we can actually take a look at the increment function. So in the increment function, we can actually say func increment uses input and amount. We'll give it a name. So if I have this function, what I'm going to need is my incrementer. I'm actually going to write a input and an increment amount. So my input is going to be 1, increment amount is going to be 2. So now what I expect is 1 plus 2 equals 3. And I'm going to call my result function or increment function. So let result equals incrementer.increment input by increment amount. And now I can write an expectation to say expect input plus increment amount to equal my result. Expected increment to use input and amount correctly. These are always useful strings to provide so that you know exactly what you were thinking or what you were expecting and why. So if I run my test now, what we see is expectation failed input plus increment amount, which equals 3, gave us a result of 4. So we can see exactly what went wrong, and we can see that our input and increment amount added together are 3. And we know that that is going to be correct because we can see that with our eyes here in the test. We can also see that result was 4, so there's a mismatch there. So what might have gone wrong? And we can dig in here and fix our implementation by removing the +1 that I added earlier. We can run our test, and we can actually see that it succeeds right now. The expect macro and Boolean conditions are really useful, especially when you perform your comparisons inside of the expect macro, because it will give you context on the values that it compared, which means that you're going to be able to know exactly what might have gone wrong. So that's great. Okay, next up, we have my check input function. That function can throw 2 errors, value too small or value too large. And just like before, I'm going to break this on purpose by just returning regardless of the error that we should be throwing. So let's actually write a test that says input validation should reject 2 small values. So input validation should reject small values. Async throws function. And what we'll do now is write down our input, which is going to be -1. And then what we'll need to do is find a way to test that our function actually returned or throws the correct error when something goes wrong. So what we'll do is the following. We'll use the expect macro, and we'll use a version of the expect macro that allows us to specify which error we want to throw. There's a couple of overloads available for that function, but the one that we are interested in is this one. The one that takes an error, so in this case, for example, validation error dot value too small. You can write a comment if we want. I'm going to skip that for now. And we can provide a closure. This closure is going to be executed, and we're expecting that closure to throw an error. So we'll fix that. Compiler error, validation error dot value too small is what we want to be thrown. Now, notice how my expectation failed. An error was expected, but none was thrown. So that makes sense. I can fix my test right now by saying throw validation error value too small, and we'll notice that everything works. That's perfect. So what happens if I get an incorrect error back instead of no error? So we'll do this, run the test, and now we'll get an expectation failed. I changed the value too small to be value too large, and now we can actually see that we expected value too small of type validation error, but value too large was thrown instead. So we can easily see what went wrong. I can also write my test so that it doesn't check for a specific error case, but that it would accept any validation error. So I can write another test. Input validation should reject large values, which is going to be an async throwing function. The input is going to be 51, and we'll use #expect. We're going to use another overload. That's the one that takes an error type. So it looks pretty much the same. I'll write validation error dot self this time. So this will allow any validation error to pass my test, even if it's not the value too large one. So what I'll do, try check input, we'll run the test. It's going to fail because we're not throwing any error. I'll copy over my error that I threw in the value too small case. I'll run the test and we'll see that it succeeds. Now in this case, testing for any kind of validation error doesn't make a ton of sense. I should really be testing for a specific error because there is only one error that I expect to be thrown. So I can change this to value too large, and we'll see that the expectation failed because we threw a value to small error. So if I fix that, both of my tests should now work. First one works, second one also works. So now let's actually make one more error in our code and test func input validation should accept values in bound. Async throws. I'll make an input of 25, and I'm going to write my expectation here. But do I really need an expectation? I could also just write this, you would think. So I can write this code, I can run it, but what happens is that my test now fails with a caught error value too large. And it becomes really complicated for me to see exactly why or when this went wrong. So I should really be using the expect macro. So I can use the expect macro to use the third overload that we saw before, which is the never type one. So I can write throws never.self and then perform my expression. So I'm basically expecting never as a type to be thrown, which can't happen. So this kind of tells my test, I don't expect anything to go wrong here ever. So if I run my test now, see it fail, and it will say an error was thrown when none was expected. And that makes sense because I broke my code on purpose. If I remove this now, we'll see that everything works as it should. So we just saw a couple of different ways to use the expect macro to check for Boolean conditions as well as errors. And you even saw how you can test that no error gets thrown in your code base. There are other ways to ensure that your app is in a certain state, for example, the require macro, which we'll look at in a separate video. I hope you've enjoyed this video and that you now have a much better understanding of the expect macro and how you can use it. If you're not subscribed to the channel, please do, and make sure that you enable notifications. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks for watching.